In the sun-baked borderlands of Arizona, 73-year-old Margaret Wilson's peaceful wildlife sanctuary becomes ground zero for an unexpected war. When the notorious Aguila Cartel burns down her main building, they have no idea who they're dealing with. Behind Margaret's gentle demeanor with injured animals lies a classified military past skills she thought she'd never use again. Her assistant Diego harbors a dangerous secret. He's a nephew of the cartel's leader sent to infiltrate the sanctuary, but after years of witnessing Margaret's compassion, his loyalties have shifted. As the cartel closes in, threatening everything she's built, Margaret makes a shocking phone call to someone she swore never to contact again. What unfolds is a high-stakes battle wits between an elderly woman protecting the defenseless creatures who depend on her and a ruthless cartel that's never failed to get what it wants. In this rural showdown, Margaret will prove that age is just a number. Redemption is possible even for those born to violence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning sun casts long shadows across Horizon Wildlife Sanctuary as Margaret Wilson makes her rounds. Her silver hair is pulled back in a practical braid, her weathered hands moving with surprising dexterity as she changes the bandage on a young thorn's injured leg. Despite being 73, Margaret moves with purpose, only a slight limp betraying years of hard physical work. There you go, little one, Margaret whispers. You'll be running with your family again. Before you know it, the sanctuary sprawls across 30 acres of Arizona desert, just 15 m from a Mexican border. Enclosures of various sizes house over 100 rescued animals, from desert tortoises to mountain lions, creatures that have been abandoned, injured, or confiscated from illegal traffickers. Margaret glances at her watch and straightens, wincing slightly as her knees protest. The volunteers would be arriving soon, and there was still so much to do. The sanctuary operated on donations and volunteer work, a constant struggle to keep afloat. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulls her attention toward the main gate. Diego Ramirez, her assistant of 3 years, parks his dusty pickup and steps out carrying 2 travel mugs of coffee. At 25, Diego has a quiet intensity about him, his dark eyes observant under the brim of his well-worn baseball cap. Morning, M. Wilson, Diego calls, crossing the yard. Got your coffee black with 1 sugar? You're a lifesaver, Diego. The new eagle giving you trouble? Diego nods toward a scratch on Margaret's forearm. Just reminded me he's still wild at heart, she replies, which is exactly as it should be. They walk together past the various enclosures, the animals stirring. As the day begins, a gray wolf watches them pass, its amber eyes tracking their movement. Sheriff Dawson called. Diego says those animal traffickers they caught last month, they've been released on bail. Margaret's expression hardens. Already? That was fast. Sheriff said their lawyers showed up with cash bail. Within hours, professional job. A troubled look crosses Margaret's face. 3rd trafficking case in this county in 2 months. Something's changing out there. Border Patrol stretched thin. Diego offers makes it easier for contraband of all kinds. Margaret studies Diego, noting something guarded in his expression. You hear things in town and whispers about who's behind it. Diego shifts uncomfortably. Some say the Aguila Cartel is expanding their operation beyond drugs, moving into exotic animals, land acquisition. Before Margaret can respond, a cheerful voice calls from the direction of the main building. Sarah Jenkins, the sanctuary's administrative manager and Margaret's oldest friend, approaches. With a clipboard at 68, Sarah's energy defies her age. Her practical short gray hair framing a face lined by decades of desert sun. Margaret, we need to talk numbers before the board meeting tomorrow. Sarah announces the medical supply budget is in the red again. Let me guess, the antibiotic for the mountain lion cubs. Among other things, Dr. Patel donated her services again, but she can't comp the medications. I'll make some calls. Margaret says the Weldon Foundation might have grant money left in their quarterly budget. As they walk toward the main office, they pass a wall with framed newspaper clippings and photographs. One faded image shows a much younger Margaret in military fatigue, standing with a group of women in a desert setting that clearly isn't Arizona. 20 years since you opened this place, Sarah says quietly. Ever regret trading in that life for this one? Margaret's answer comes without hesitation. Not for a single day. Inside the main office, Margaret settles behind a desk cluttered with paperwork and veterinary journals. A detailed map of the sanctuary property hangs on one wall with neighboring ranches and terrain features clearly marked. The phone rings, and Sarah answers, her expression shifting from professional to concerned. Yes, he's here now. I'll let her know. She hangs up and turns to Margaret There's someone at the gate says he represents a development company interested in the property. Margaret's jaw tightens, almost imperceptibly. Third one this year. Want to send him away. No, Margaret decides, standing up. I'll talk to him at the main gate of luxury. SUV with tinted windows idles in the late morning heat. A man in his 40s steps out as Margaret approaches, his tailored suit incongruous against the dusty backdrop. Despite the temperature, he looks perfectly comfortable, like someone accustomed to hostile environments of all kinds. Ms. Wilson. He extends a manicured hand. Alejandro Vega, representing Verde Development Group. Margaret doesn't take his hand. Mr. Vega, what brings a development company all the way out here? Vaga is offended by the rebuff. He doesn't show it. His smile remains fixed, calculating. My client are interested in acquiring property in this region. Your sanctuary sits on a particularly valuable parcel. This is conservation land. Nevertheless, my clients have authorized me to offer you $3 million. Vega says smoothly, substantially above market value. Value. Margaret's expression doesn't change. This land isn't for sale, Mr. Vaga, as I've told the other developers who've approached me. Vega's smile tightens slightly. The others weren't prepared to offer what we are. $3 million would allow you to relocate your operation to a larger property, perhaps somewhere more hospitable. These animals have been through enough trauma. Margaret replies firmly. They won't be relocated again. A subtle shift occurs in Vegas. Demeanor is pleasant, facade slipping just enough to reveal something cold underneath. My clients are not accustomed to being refused, Miss Wilson. Neither am I, Mr. Vega. Vaga reaches into his jacket and produces a business card. I urge you to reconsider some opportunities only present themselves. Once Margaret takes the card without looking at it. Is that a threat? Merely an observation. Vega replies, the board region can be unpredictable. A woman your age running this place alone, it would be a shame if something happened. And you couldn't care for these animals anymore. I've survived worse than veiled threats from men. Inexpensive is suit your clients will need to find another piece of land. As Vega returns to his vehicle, he pauses. We'll be in touch, Miss Wilson. After the SUV disappears down the dusty road, Margaret finally looks at the business bus car. Below Vega's name and contact information is a small logo, a stylized jaguar rendered in deep green. Diego approaches cautiously, having watched the exchange from a distance. Everything okay? Margaret hands him the card. What do you make of this logo? Diego takes the card. His expression carefully neutral, though his fingers tighten almost imperceptibly. Never has he seen it before. Another developer trying their luck. Margaret studies Diego's face. Something like that back in her office. Margaret unlocks a drawer with a key she keeps around her neck. From it, she removes a small worn notebook and flips through the pages until she finds a newspaper clipping. The article details cartel activity in the border region from 2 years prior. In the corner of a photograph sees shipment. The same Jaguar logo is barely visible on one of the crates. Sarah enters with a stack of bills. Was he persistent? These developers usually are different from the others. Margaret says, quietly returning the notebook to the drawer. This one wasn't just a businessman. What do you mean? He was connected to the kind of man who delivers messages for people who don't like to show their faces. That evening, as the sanctuary settles into twilight, quiet Margaret sits on the porch of her modest cabin watching the last light fade from the western sky. The silhouettes of saguaro cacti stand like sentinels against the darkening horizon. From somewhere in the sanctuary, a wolf howls, a sound echoing across the desert. Margaret reaches down to scratch behind the ears of an elderly German shepherd lying at her feet, her personal companion. Not a sanctuary resident. The dog's gray muzzle rests on her shoe, his loyalty unwavering despite his advanced age. Getting complicated out there, Rex, she says. Softly inside her cabin, Margaret opens her laptop and begins researching. Verde Development Group, the company, appears legitimate. At first glance, a corporate website showcasing luxury developments across the Southwest. But as she digs deeper, she finds connections to Shell Corporation's properties changing hands multiple times in short periods. Her phone rings, displaying Sheriff Mike Dawson's number. Evening, Mike. She answers, just checking. The sheriff's voice comes through tired. After a long day, had another trafficking incident reported near Eagle Pass. Thought you should know, being so close. What kind of trafficking? Exotic birds. This time, Border Patrol intercepted a truck, but most of the smugglers scattered across the border. Birds were in bad shape. Margaret frowns. Third case in 2 months. That's not coincidence. No, Sheriff Dawson agrees. It's organized, but we're stretched thin out here. I had a visitor today. Margaret says development company called Verde. The representative made what felt like a threat. There's a pause on the line. Verde, you said, I'll run the name. See, If anything comes up, you got his card, yes, has a Jaguar logo on it. Another longer pause. Describe it to me. Margaret details the logo, and the sheriff's silence. On the other end of the line speaks volumes. Mike, I've seen that logo before. He finally says, on some evidence from a drug bust last year, ATF took over case. So my instinct for a right, Margaret, says grimly, it's cartel connected. I can't confirm that officially the sheriff. Cautions, but unofficially be careful, Margaret, if they're interested in. Your land is not for a retirement community. After ending the call, Margaret stares at the business. Card again, the stylized Jaguar. Seems to watch her with predatory intent. She opens the locked drawer again and takes out not the notebook this time, but an old flip phone. She powers it on and scrolls with minimal contact, list stopping at one labeled Simply J. Her finger hovers over the call button, but after a moment's hesitation, she powers the phone down again and returns it to the drawer knot. Yet she murmurs to herself, but soon, maybe outside in the darkness beyond the sanctuary's perimeter, the beam of a flashlight briefly illuminates the fence line before disappearing a moment. Later, the distant sound of a vehicle engine starts up and fades into the night. The sanctuary may appear peaceful, but Margaret knows better war is coming to her doorstep. Whether she's ready or not telling, and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Margaret finds Diego inspecting a section of fence that's been cut overnight. Fresh boot prints in the dirt reveal a deliberate intrusion. Someone came through here, Diego says, pointing to clean cut in a chain link. At least 3 different sets of prints. Margaret kneels to examine the tracks. Her experienced eyes noting details that would escape most people. The depth and pattern indicate men carrying heavy equipment, moving with purpose. They were inside the sanctuary, she concludes, standing with a grimace as her knees protest. Should we call the sheriff? Diego asks. Margaret nods. And I want every enclosure checked, make sure all the animals are counted for. While Diego organizes the volunteers for the inspection, Margaret walks the perimeter, studying the ground with focused attention. Her gaze catches small details, a cigarette, but with Spanish writing on the filter boot prints with a distinctive tread pattern, a piece of dark fabric caught on the Fun's cut edge. She collects these items methodically, using a pen to slide them into plastic bags she keeps for collecting animal waste samples. Old habits from a different life resurfacing naturally. Dr. Maya Patel arrives for her weekly volunteer shift, her SUV loaded with donated medical supplies. The veterinarian's warm smile fades when she sees the damaged fence trouble. Dr. Patel asks, dark eyes concerned behind her. Glasses, possibly. Margaret Ainers could use your help checking the animals, make sure none of them have been drugged or tampered with. By midday, the inspection reveals no missing or injured animals, which deepens Margaret's unease rather than relieving it. They just walked around, Sarah says, reviewing security camera footage. 3 figures moving through the sanctuary around 2 a.m. But they didn't approach any enclosures they were surveilling. Margaret says, learning the layout for what Sarah asked, the worry lines around her eyes deepening before Margaret can respond. Her office phone rings. She listens without speaking, her expression hardening. After a brief conversation, she hangs up and turns to Sarah. The bank called. They're reconsidering our loan extension. Sarah's eyes widen. Why we've never missed a payment. The manager mentioned changing economic conditions in the area, vague enough to mean nothing specific enough that we understand what's happening. You think it's connected to that development company pressure. Tactics, Margaret confirms. Cut off our funding, force us to sell. Sarah sinks into a chair. What do? We fight, Margaret says. Simply, Dr. Patel, how many of the animals could be safely relocated if it came to that? Dr. Patel considers this. Maybe 30% the younger ones from the birds arrest. The older predators, the ones with complex medical needs, they'd suffer tremendously from relocation stress. Then relocation isn't an option, Margaret concludes that afternoon. Margaret notices a black SUV parked on the ridge overlooking the sanctuary. When she walks toward her truck, clearly intending to drive up there, the vehicle starts and drives away. Later, she receives an email from an anonymous sender. The message contains photos of her working around the sanctuary, clearly taken without her knowledge. The final image shows her asleep in her cabin. The text reads, simply reconsider. The offer. Margaret's jaw tightens, but she shows no other reaction to the intimidation attempt. Instead, she spends the evening installing additional security cameras around the perimeter of the property, moving with the efficiency of someone who is secured. Locations before that night, Sheriff Dorson visits, examining the fence damage and the evidence Margaret collected. I ran the name Verde Development. He says, standing on Margaret's porch as twilight deepens. It's a shell company incorporated in Panama. The address is a mail drop, and the logo, the sheriff's expression, is grim match for the Aguila Cartel. They've been expanding operations in this region, moving beyond drugs into land acquisition, and wildlife trafficking they want a smuggling corridor. Margaret concludes my sanctuary sits at the intersection of two canyons that create a natural funnel from the border. Minimal border patrol presence due to the difficult terrain. Sheriff Dawson looks impressed you figured that out fast. I've always had a good for terrain, Margaret says, without elaboration. What can you do officially? The sheriff removes his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. Not much. Without concrete evidence of criminal activity, I can increase patrols, but we're stretched thin already, and unofficially, I can let you know if I hear anything, and I can look the other way if you decide to enhance your security measures. Appreciate it, Mike. After the sheriff leaves, Mark retrieves the old flip phone from its hiding place this time. She makes the call. It's Wilson. She says, when someone answers, I need to talk to Jenkins. Yes, I know it's been 15 years. Tell her about Aguila. There's a pause as Margaret waits, and then her expression softens slightly. Jane, yes, I'm still in Arizona. No, I'm not an immediate danger, but I need information on the Aguila cartels. Operations in the border region. I know you're retired too, but we both know you keep your ear to ground. After ending the call, Margaret stares out at her sanctuary, the full moon illuminating the enclosures where her rescued animals sleep, unaware of the human dangers gathered around them. Dawn breaks. With a violent disruption, Margaret is jolted awake by the sound of a massive explosion, the concussive force rattling the windows of her cabin. She bolts upright, years of training kicking in as she pulls on boots and grabs a flashlight in one fluid motion. Outside, the eastern sky is painted orange, but not from the sunrise. Flames leap from the sanctuary's main supply building. The fire, already consuming the structure. The blaze illuminates the panic activity as volunteers rush to move animals from nearby enclosures to safety. Get the water pump running. Margaret shouts to Diego, who appears at her side, face grim. Sarah, call the fire department. Despite their best efforts, the building is a total lost by the time the rural fire department arrives. The flames are contained before they can spread to nearby structures, but the building, which housed most of their medical supplies and feed, is nothing but smoldering ruins. Professional job, Sheriff Dawson says, quietly standing beside Margaret as they watch the fire crew pack up their equipment. He holds up an evidence bag containing the remnants of an incendiary device timer. Accelerant. This wasn't kids messing around. I told you they were serious. Margaret says, her voice tight with controlled anger. I've reached out to the FBI. They've had Verde Development Group on their radar. Suspected money laundering for the Aguila Cartel. How long before they can move on them? Building a case takes time, Margaret. Months, maybe years. We don't have months, Margaret says, watching as volunteers salvage what little they can from the scorched remains. With the supplies gone and the animals to feed, I can post a deputy here, but you're stretched thin, I know. Sheriff Dawson studies her face. You were military intelligence. Weren't you not just support staff like you told everyone when you moved here? Margaret says, nothing, which is answer enough. That's what I thought. The sheriff continues, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I know that. Look, the way you assessed the situation, collected evidence, secured your perimeter. That's not something you learn watching nature documentaries. Margaret walks to a nearby enclosure where an elderly lion with a graying man watches him. She places her hand on the fence, and the lion approaches, rubbing against it in recognition. I won't let them hurt you or take your home, she murmurs to the lion. Sheriff Dawson's expression softens. You know, sometimes I forget who you used to be. Then I see you like this, calm in a crisis, planning 3 steps ahead. That woman is long gone, Mike, is she? Because right now I'm seeing the same Margaret Wilson who led operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. That was another life, maybe, but those skills might be exactly what you need now. After everyone leaves, Margaret meets with her core team in the staff room. The atmosphere is tense, but determined the insurance will cover the building. But it'll take weeks to process. Sarah reports, glancing at her notes. And our supplies are critically low. The Wellington Foundation donation came through at least. Dr. Patel adds, not much, but it'll help with basic medications for the next few weeks. I can reach out to other veterinary practices, see if they can donate supplies. Dr. Patel offers we need to think longer term. Margaret says this was just their opening move. The next morning brings a visitor Margaret hasn't seen in 15 years. Jane Jenkins, her former commanding officer in military intelligence, arrives in an unremarkable sedan, dressed in civilian clothes that do nothing to diminish her commanding presence. At 70, Jane carries herself with the same authority she had decades ago. They sit in Margaret's small office away from the volunteers and staff. Verde Development Group is definitely a front, Jane says examining the documents Margaret has collected, the Aguila Cartel has been diversifying, moving beyond drugs into wildlife trafficking, land acquisition along the border for smuggling corridors. Why target my sanctuary? Specifically, there's miles of borderland in this region. Jane points to a map. Your property sits at a strategic point where two canyons create a natural funnel from the border. Minimal border patrol presence due to the difficult terrain and the existence of the sanctuary gives them a perfect cover for vehicle movement. Wildlife transport vehicles come and going wouldn't raise suspicion. Margaret realizes exactly. They've been planning this for months. The animal trafficking operations in the area were test runs probing local law enforcement response times. Margaret's gaze drifts to the window where she can see Diego organizing volunteers to sort through donated supplies. There's something else I need to ask you about. Margaret says quietly. My assistant Diego Ramirez, he's been with me for 3 years, dedicated, hardworking. But sometimes you suspect he might have connections to the cartel. He's from the border region. Sometimes he gets phone calls he takes in private, speaking Spanish too quietly for anyone to hear. And when Vega came, there was something the way Diego looked at that logo. Jane nods grimly. I'll run a check on him. Quietly, as Jane prepares to leave, she hands Margaret a small device, satellite phone, secure line. If things escalate, call me immediately. I still have contacts who can move faster than official channels. Thank you, Jane. Jane embraces Margaret briefly. We took an oath to protect the innocent Margaret. That doesn't expire with our service. After Jane leaves, Margaret watches Diego working with the volunteers, showing him how to properly organize the donated medical supplies. His dedication seems genuine, but years and intelligence have taught Margaret that appearances can be deceiving. That evening, Margaret retreats to her cabin and opens a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard under her bed. From it, she removes a small case containing specialized equipment from her military days, a tactical flashlight, a combat knife, and a small device for detecting electronic surveillance. She methodically sweeps her cabin for bugs, finding nothing. Then she pulls out a map of the sanctuary and begins marking potential weak points in the perimeter, creating a defensive strategy as naturally as breathing a sudden noise outside alerts her. Moving silently to the window, she sees Diego taking a call on his cell phone, walking away from the volunteer housing toward a secluded area to talk. His posture is tense, his free hand gesturing sharply as he speaks rapidly in Spanish. Margaret's suspicions deepen. War has come to her sanctuary, and she must now determine who she can truly trust before the enemy makes their next move. The next morning, Margaret receives a text from Jane. Background check complete on Ramirez. Call me ASAP. Margaret's stomach tightens. She waits until the morning feeding routine is complete, ensuring Diego is occupied with the mountain lion enclosure before retreating to a secluded spot near the perimeter fence using secure satellite phone. Jane provided she makes the call. What did you find? Margaret asks. Without preamble, Diego Ramirez is Victor Ramirez's nephew. Jane says, her voice tense through the encrypted connection. Margaret's breath catches. Victor Ramirez, the regional head of the Aguila Cartel's operations, a man responsible for dozens of killings along the border. Are you certain? She manages, watching Diego in the distance as he carefully handles a tranquilized mountain lion EAB while Dr. Patel administers medication. Positive. Jane confirms. But there's more complexity here. Diego's father, Victor's brother, was killed by the cartel 5 years ago when he tried to leave the organization. According to my sources, Diego was forced to work for his uncle as penance for his father's betrayal. Margaret processes this information, observing the gentle way Diego carries the cub back to its mother. So he's not here willingly. Probably not. The question is, where do his loyalties lie now? After 3 years working with you, I need to talk to him. Margaret, that's risky. Jane warns. If he warns his uncle, I know Diego. Margaret interrupts. It is being coerced. He might be an ally, not an enemy. After ending the call, Margaret spends the day observing Diego more carefully. She notices things she'd overlooked before. The way his shoulders tense when vehicles approach the sanctuary, how he positions himself with clear sight lines to entrances and exits, his habit of checking his phone whenever it vibrates with the anxiety of someone who can't afford to miss a call. These weren't just the behaviors of a dedicated employee. They were the habits of someone living under constant threat. That evening, as dust settles over the sanctuary, Margaret intercepts Diego as he's finishing his evening rounds. Diego, I need to speak with you privately. Something flickers in his eyes. Awareness, perhaps fear, but he nods and follows her to her office. Once inside, Margaret locks the door and turns to face him. I know who your uncle is. Diego go. The color drains from his face. His hands, usually so steady with the animals, tremble slightly before he clenches them into fists. Miss Wilson, I need the truth. Margaret interrupts, her voice firm, but not unkind. All of it now. Diego sinks into a chair, looking suddenly much younger. Then his 25 years of heavy silence fills the room before he finally speaks. He set me here 3 years ago. Diego admits, his voice barely audible, to learn to lay out the routines for when they decided to take a land. So everything's been a lie, Margaret asks, masking the hurt beneath the question. Diego looks up, his eyes pleading, not everything, not for a long time. He takes a shaky breath before continuing. At first, yes, I reported back weekly, but then I saw what you were doing here, how you cared for the animals, for the people, how you gave everyone a second chance, even the wolves and bears that others would have destroyed for being oh too dangerous. Margaret watches him without interrupting, her expression unreadable. 6 months, and I started lying in my reports. Diego continues, telling my uncle's security was better than it was, that the land had problems that would make it difficult to use as they planned. Why risk that? Your uncle doesn't seem like the forgiving type, because you showed me there was another way to live. Diego says, bitter irony in his voice, not in fear, not hurting others to survive. When my father tried to leave the cartel, they made me watch what they did to him. Said it was a lesson. Margaret's expression softened slightly. The fire the other night, I was supposed to leave the back gate unlocked. I didn't. That's why they had to cut the fence. Instead, Diego meets her eyes directly. They're suspicious of me now. What's their plan, Diego? They're coming tomorrow night. My uncle got tired of the slow approach. They'll burn everything, make it look like an accident with the sanctuary gone. The property value drops. Verde Development swoops in to buy the distressed property at a fraction of the price. How many men? At least a dozen armed. Margaret is silent for a long moment, thinking, you could have warned me sooner. I was afraid. Diego admits, for you, for the animals, for myself. Why tell me now? Because you trusted me for 3 years, even when you had no reason to. Diego's voice grows stronger. I've seen what you built here, Miss Wilson. It's worth protecting. Margaret studies and making a decision. If you're telling the truth, Diego, I'm going to need your help. You still trust me after what I just told you? Everyone deserves a second chance. Margaret says, the ghost of smile touching her lips, even cartel nephews who find their conscience. She moves to her desk and pulls out maps of the sanctuary. Tell me exactly how they plan to come in every detail. As Diego explains, Margaret takes notes, her military training visibly taking over as she begins to formulate a plan. They'll come through Eagle Pass. Diego explains, pointing to a narrow canyon on the map. 2 vehicles, 1 team on foot as backup. They'll hit the main building first and the medical facility. Once the buildings are burning, they'll open the predator enclosures. Maximum destruction. Margaret nods. Make it look like a wildlife disaster, animals escaping during a fire. Exactly my uncle's in Fora Carlos. He's leading the operation is ex-military Mexican special forces. And you're rolling. All this. Diego's expression darkens. I'm supposed to ensure security cameras are disabled and keep you distracted at the north end of property. Margaret considers this information. We need evidence, something concrete that links Verde to Aguila, something I can take to the FBI that will force them to act now, not month from now. My uncle keeps records at his ranch. Diego says, detailed logs of all operations, including the shell companies. Is how he maintains control, knowing what everyone else is doing, and you have access to this ranch limited. I'm expected for family dinner every Sunday. Security is lighter than, but getting documents out would be extremely risky. We need to think bigger. Margaret says, tapping the map. If they're coming in tomorrow night with such force, there must be something more to this land than just a smuggling corridor. Diego hesitates, then nods. They've been using the caves in the eastern canyon to store product before distribution, millions in drugs, weapons, and exotic animals ready for transport. That's why they can't risk law enforcement scrutiny of this area. Margaret realizes one search with the right warrants would expose everything. Diego confirms the sanctuary is their blind spot. No one questions vehicles coming and going from a wildlife facility. A plan begins to form in Margaret's mind. We need to postpone tomorrow's attack without making them suspicious. Can you convince your uncle you need more time? Possibly. I could tell him the sheriff has increased patrols due to the fire, that waiting another week would be safer. Do it. Margaret instructs, and I need to speak with Jane again once. Diego leaves. Margaret makes another call on a secure line. We have confirmation, she tells Jane. And a bigger problem than we thought, the Aguila Cartel is using caves on my eastern border for major storage, drugs, weapons, trafficked animals. That explains their urgency. Jane says, what's your plan? I need surveillance equipment, the kind we use in Kandahar, and I need information on a Carlos Mendoza, ex-Mexican special forces now working as an enforcer for Victor Ramirez. I know him. Jane says, surprise evident in her voice. Dishonorable discharge 8 years ago, rumored to have been involved in the civilian massacre near Nogales. Very dangerous. Margaret, all the more reason to be prepared. I can have equipment to you by tomorrow morning. What about Diego? He's with us at considerable risk to himself Can you be sure Margaret thinks of the genuine care she's seen Diego show the animals his growing confidence over 3 years the way he'd looked her in the eye when confessing his original mission? Yes, he's been living a double life for years, Jane. Now he's choosing which life he wants to keep. The next morning, a nondescript delivery truck arrives at the sanctuary. The driver, a weathered man in his 60s who introduces himself simply as Frank, helps Margaret unload several crates labeled as veterinary supplies. Once the truck departs, Margaret and Diego carry the crates to a secure storage area. Inside, they find state-of-the-art surveillance equipment, body cameras disguised as ordinary buttons, and small tracking devices. These are military-grade. Diego observes examining one of the cameras. Jane always did have excellent resources. Margaret replies, sorting through the equipment. We need to place these around the sanctuary, focusing on areas your uncle's men will likely use for access. They spend a morning strategically placing cameras and motion sensors, careful to keep their activities hidden from the other volunteers. Meanwhile, Sarah coordinates a partial evacuation of the sanctuary's animals, moving the smaller, more vulnerable creatures to temporary housing at a sympathetic rancher's property nearby. Dr. Patel has arranged for a clinic to take the birds and smaller mammals, Sarah reports. But the large predators, they stay. Margaret says firmly moving them would stress them too much. We protect them here. By afternoon, Diego receives a text message. His expression turns grim as he shows it to Margaret. My uncle agreed to postpone the operation, but only for 3 days, and he wants me at the ranch. Tonight, unscheduled family dinner. He's suspicious. Margaret concludes, I need to go, or will only confirm his doubts. It's too risky. I don't have a choice, Diego insists. If I don't show up, they'll know something's wrong. Margaret considers their options. Take this, she says, handing him one of the button cameras. It's activated by pressing twice. Only use it if you can do so without being detected. As Diego prepares to leave, Margaret catches his arm. Be careful. These men, they're not just business associates to you, they're family that ended when they killed my father. Diego says, his voice hardening. The only family I care about now is here. After Diego departs, Margaret meets with Sheriff Dawson in her office, sharing some, but not all of what she's learned. I have an informant inside the cartel. She explains they're planning a major operation against the sanctuary, and they're using caves on my eastern border for storage. That's why they want this land so badly. The sheriff realizes what kind of storage. Everything: drugs, weapons, exotic animals, waiting for transport, millions in contraband. Sheriff Dawson whistles low. That's federal territory. Margaret, dead Idia fish, and wildlife all roll you into one. And how long would it take to coordinate all those agencies? Meanwhile, my sanctuary burns. My animals are killed or scattered, and the cartel walks away clean. The sheriff removes his hat, rubbing his forehead. What do you need from me? Just be ready when I have concrete evidence. I'll need you to move fast. Call on the right people. This informant of yours, Sheriff Dawson says carefully, they're reliable. Margaret thinks of Diego, the risk he's taking even now with their life. As evening falls, Margaret grows increasingly anxious about Diego. He should have checked in by now. She paces the length of her cabin, is watching her with concerned eyes. Her satellite phone finally buzzes with a text message. Dinner running long. Uncle asking many questions. Will report when safe. Margaret releases a breath. She hadn't real eyes. She was holding. At least he was alive and able to communicate. She turns her attention to surveillance feeds, checking each camera's position and function. Tomorrow, they would begin gathering evidence of the cartel's operations in the caves. With luck, they would have enough to force federal action before the 3-day deadline expired. A knock at her cabin door startles her. Sarah stands outside, her expression troubled. There's someone here too. Steve says he's from the county assessor's office, wants to inspect the property for a tax reevaluation. Margaret checks her watch. 8:30 p.m. Well after business hours. The county assessor doesn't make evening visits. That's what I thought. Sarah agrees. He's very insistent, though, as official-looking paperwork. Where is he now? Waiting by the main gate. I told him I need a check. If he were available, good, keep him there. I'll handle this. Margaret retrieves a small canister of pepper spray from her desk drawer, tucking it into her pocket. Before heading to main gate, a bailing man in a rumpled suit stands beside a county vehicle, scrolling through his phone with apparent boredom. Can I help you? Margaret asks, keeping a cautious distance. The man looks up, his smile too practiced to be genuine. Ms. Wilson, John Mercy, county assessor's office. We're conducting emergency reevaluations of properties in fur-prone areas following recent incidents. Margaret notes the lack of a proper identification badge, the way his suit jacket bulges slightly on one side. At this hour, county offices closed 3 hours ago. We're working overtime due to the urgency of the situation. He replies smoothly, the assessment will only take about an hour. I'll need to see proper identification and verification from your supervisor, Margaret. It says firmly, and you'll need to return during regular business hours. Demands friendly demeanor slips Miss Wilson this. Evaluation is mandatory. If you refuse access, it could result in penalties, and I'll accept those penalties through proper channels. Margaret replies, good night, Mr. Mercer. As the man reluctant returns to his vehicle, Margaret memorizes the license plate once he drives. Away, she immediately calls Sheriff Dawson. Mike, I just had a visit from a fake county assessor. Can you run a plate for me? The sheriff calls back 15 minutes later. Vehicle is registered to a rental company in Nails, rented 3 days ago to a shell corporation called Horizon Investments. Another Aguila front. Margaret concludes almost certainly they're watching you. Margaret, be careful. After ending the call, Margaret checks her surveillance feeds again. The fake assessor's visit confirms her suspicions. The cell isn't waiting passively for their delayed operation. They're actively gathering intelligence, probing her defenses. As midnight approaches, with still no word from Diego, Margaret makes a difficult decision. She retrieves the old flip phone once more, but this time scrolls past J to a contact. Labeled simply T, her finger hovers over the call button. This was a call she'd truly been avoiding, the one that would pull someone else she cared about into danger, but with Diego compromised and the cartel closing and she was running out of options. Taking a deep breath, Margaret presses call. The phone rings for times before a gruff voice answers. This better be important. No greeting, no pleasantries. Hello? Do you too, Thomas? Margaret says, her voice softening despite herself. A pause. Maggie, surprise, replaces gruffness. Is that really you? It's me. I need your help. Another pause. Longer this time. You wouldn't call unless it was serious life or death. Margaret confirms, where you? Same place I've been. For 15 years, the wildlife sanctuary in Arizona. I'll be there by morning. Thomas says without hesitation, tell me what I'm walking into. Margaret outlines the situation, the cartel's interest in her land, the burn supply building, Diego's role as a double agent to coming attack Aguila Cartel. Thomas muses. They've been expanding operations significantly. Your sanctuary sits at a strategic crossing point. You've been tracking them. A driver. Chuckle. Retirement doesn't mean I stop paying attention. Maggie keeps the mind sharp. How much trouble will this cause with your situation? Margaret asks. Carefully, the agreement was that I stay out of domestic operations. Thomas says this is family. Different rules apply. After ending the call, Margaret checks the Sanu's perimeter cameras one last time before trying to sleep. Rest proves elusive. Her mind cycling through contingency plans. Escape routes, defensive positions. At dawn, she's already awake when headlights sweep across her window. A dusty pickup truck pulls up to her cabin, and a tall figure emerges, moving with the deliberate economy of someone accustomed to conserving energy for when it matters most. Thomas Wilson stands too, and taller than his sister, his weathered face lined with years of sun and experience. At 77, his body remains lean and powerful, though he moves with the careful precision of someone managing old injuries. His silver hair is cut short in a style that hasn't changed in decades. Margaret steps onto the porch, and for a moment the siblings simply look at each other across 15 years of silence. You look good, Maggie. Thomas says, finally running this place. Agrees with you. You look older. Margaret replies with a hint of a smile. That's because I am older. He retrieves a duffel bag from his truck. You gonna invite me in, or should we start planning a defense strategy in the open inside? Margaret brings coffee while Thomas surveys her cabin with a professional eye, noting exit sight lines. Potential. Cover your security is decent, he comments. Better than most civilian operations. I forget everything. Margaret says. Thomas sits at her small kitchen table, wrapping weather hands around his coffee mug. Tell me about this, Diego. You trust him? I do. He was planted here by his uncle, but he's been protecting the sanctuary for years now, feeding misinformation back to the cartel. Family ties run deep, Thomas warns, especially in cartel culture. He watched them murder his father. Margaret says quietly, some family eyes are severed with blood. Thomas nods, once accepting her assessment. And this Jane Jenkins, she's providing equipment and intelligence. She still has contacts in the agencies. Always did have the best network. Thomas acknowledges. What's your plan? We need evidence linking Verde development to the Aguila Cartel and their smuggling operation. Diego says they're using caves on my eastern border for major storage. Thomas's eyes sharpen with interest. That explains a lot. Recent cartel supply shortages. In certain regions, the increased border patrol interceptions. Elsewhere, they've been funneling everything through this route. How do you know? All this? A shrug. Like I said, I keep track of things. Force of habit. A sharp knock interrupts them. Margaret opens the door to find Sarah. Her expression alarmed. Diego's back. Sarah says he's hurt in the medical building. Dr. Patel is treating a gash on Diego's forehead while he sits tensely on an examination table, his shirt torn and bloody. What happened, Margaret demands, entering with Thomas. Close behind, Diego's eyes flick to Thomas with instant weariness. Who's this? My brother, Margaret explains. Thomas. This is Diego. Diego Thomas is here to help. Diego relaxes. Slightly, your uncle found a camera. He tells Margaret, I managed to convince him. I didn't know what was that. You must have planted on me, did? He believed you enough to keep me alive, Diego says grimly. But they roughed me up to make sure I wasn't holding anything. Back, did you learn anything useful? Diego nods, wincing as Dr. Patel cleans his wound. The caves, they not just storage, they're processing labs too, cutting drugs, tagging exotic animals with false documentation, repackaging weapons. That's why they need the sanctuary land. Margaret realizes her operation has outgrown the caves. Exactly, they plan to expand using your property as cover. Wildlife sanctuary becomes a perfect front for moving product, and the timeline moved up. They're coming tomorrow. Night, not in 3 days. Diego's expression turns grim. My uncle is bringing additional men from Nogales, at least 20 heavily armed. Thomas whistles softly. That's not a raid, that's an invasion force. I knew something was off when that fake assessor showed up. Margaret says they're not just trying to dry me out anymore. They want to eliminate any witnesses, make a clean sweep. We need to evacuate Sarah, and insists, having listened in growing horror, call the FBI, the Border Patrol, anyone by the time the feds coordinate a response. The cartel will be gone, and our evidence. With them, Margaret explains, we need to document their operation in the caves, establish a connection, divert a development beyond doubt. That suicide, Sarah argues, not necessarily. Thomas interjects, studying the sanctuary blueprint Margaret has spread SPR out. A small team could access the caves from your property, plant surveillance equipment, get out clean. And that's your plan, Sarah demands, looking from Margaret to Thomas. The two of you against 20 armed cartel members. 3, Diego corrects. Standing up despite Dr. Patel's protests. I know the cave layout. I've been there for meetings. Sarah stares at Margaret. Who are you people really? Margaret exchanges a look with Thomas. Before answering, I was military intelligence special reconnaissance unit operating in South America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. Thomas. Was Delta Force. Was Thomas raises an eyebrow. Some skills you don't lose. Maggie. Sarah sinks into a chair processing this revelation. All these years, I thought you were just a wildlife rehabilitator with a military background. I am a wildlife rehabilitator. Margaret says gently, that part was never a lie, but before that I led operations in places where failure meant more than just missing a funding deadline. Dr. Patel finishes bandaging Diego's head. So what do we do, those of us without special forces training? You evacuate. Margaret says firmly, take all the animals that can be safely moved. Sarah, contact Sheriff Dawson, tell him to be ready, but to stay clear until I call. And you're going to the cave? Sarah asks, still struggling to reconcile this new version of her friend with the woman she thought she knew. We need evidence, and we need to know exactly what we're facing. Margaret confirms, if all goes well, we'll be in and out before they know we've been there. As the others leave to begin preparations, Thomas pulls Margaret aside. This isn't just about the S-side, is it? He asks quietly. You could call me years ago for a pleasant family reunion. Instead, you call when you need the skills. Neither of us is particularly proud of having. Margaret meets her brother's gaze. The sanctuary is my redemption. Thomas A. Chance to protect lives instead of taking them to build, instead of destroy. I won't let the cartel take that from me. Thomas nods, once understanding perfectly. Then let's make sure they don't as dusk approaches. Margaret, Thomas, and Diego prepare for their reconnaissance mission to the caves. They spread topographical maps across Margaret's kitchen table, with Diego marking entry points, and guard positions 2 guards at the main entrance. Diego explains, pointing to a narrow fissure in the canyon wall. Secondary entrance here, usually unguarded but monitored by motion sensors. Interior chambers extended about 200 m into the mountain. Thomas studies the layout. Motion sensors can be dealt with. What about inside? Personnel security measures 3 to 5 men at any given time. Basic alarm system, security cameras at key points. The main storage area is here. Diego indicates a large chamber deep in the cave system. That's where you'll find everything. Drug packages ready for shipment, exotic animals in transit, crates, weapons, and documentation. Margaret asks, we need paper trails, something linking all this to Verde development. My uncle keeps a ledger. Diego says old school, doesn't trust computers. Records of all transactions, front companies, bribes. He updates it personally whenever he visits the operation. Where does he keep it? Office at the back of the main chamber, metal cabinet locked. Thomas checks his watch. We go in 2 hours. Minimal equipment, night vision. Recording devices in and out in 30. Minut's primary objective is surveillance placement and evidence gathering, not engagement, as Thomas and Diego continue planning. Margaret steps outside for a moment alone. The sanctuary is unusually quiet. Many of the animals already relocated to temporary housing. She walks to the lion enclosure, where the elderly lion watches her approach. "I'll keep your home safe, Leo," she promises softly. "You'll be back here soon." A twig snaps. In the underbrush beyond the perimeter fence, Margaret freezes her senses. Suddenly alert, slowly, she retreats into the shadows of nearby maintenance. Shed her movements deliberate and silent. Two figures emergency from the trees, moving with the cautious precision of scouts. They wear dark clothing with holstered weapons visible at their hips. One carries high-powered binoculars, scanning the sanctuary's buildings methodically. Margaret slips back toward her cabin. Keeping the shadows inside, she finds Thomas checking a compact pistol. "We have visitors," she says quietly too. Scouts armed checking our perimeter. Thomas slides a weapon into a concealed holster. "Advanced team mapping your security measures, looking for alarm systems, change of plans." Margaret decides if they're already scouting, the main force could arrive sooner than tomorrow night. Diego enters, having overheard my uncle doesn't usually send scouts this early, unless what Thomas prompts, unless he doesn't trust the intelligence he already has. Diego finishes, his expression grim. He suspects I've switch sides, and we move now. Margaret decides to cast reconnaissance. "Can't wait." Thomas nods agreement. "What about the scouts?" "I'll handle them." Margaret says. Diego show Thomas the route to the caves. "I'll join you at the Rendezvous Point in 30 minutes. "You sure you don't want backup?" Thomas asks. Studying his sister, Margaret's expression hardens with quiet determination. "I protected this land for 15 years. 2 scouts aren't going to change that after." They leave. Margaret changes into dark clothing and retrieves a small case from beneath the floorboard in her cabin. Inside are items from her previous life: a combat knife, a compact stun gun, zip ties. She takes only what's necessary, moving with practiced efficiency. Outside, she circles behind the maintenance buildings, tracking the scouts by their movement through the underbrush. They've separated slightly, one heading toward the main office, while the other approaches the predator. Enclosures. Margaret follows the scout near the predator. Enclosures keeping. Downwind, the man moves confidently, clearly believing himself unobserved as he photographs the security camera positions with his phone. When he pauses to examine the lock on the wolf enclosure, Margaret strikes. One hand clamps over his mouth, while the other presses a stun gun to his side. The man convulses briefly before going limp. Working quick, Margaret zip ties his wrists and ankles, uses his own bandana as a gag, and drags him into a supply shed. Securing him to a support beam, she relieves him of his weapon and phone before locking the shed. The second scout proves more challenging. Margaret tracks him to the main office, where he's attempting to bypass the security system. He's more experienced, checking his surroundings regularly. As he works, Margaret circles the building, creating a small distraction by knocking over a bucket near the back entrance. When the scout investigates, she's waiting. The brief struggle ends with the scout unconscious, secured in the same manner as his partner. A search of his pockets reveals a two-way radio. Margaret listens long enough to confirm no immediate backup is expected before heading to the Rendezvous Point. Thomas and Diego were waiting in a dry wash half a mile from the sanctuary, concealed among boulders. Scouts, Thomas asks. As Margaret approaches, contained, she replies simply they weren't expected to report back immediately. "We have time." Diego leads him along a barely visible game trail that winds up through the rocky terrain toward the eastern canyon. The night is clear, a half moon providing just enough light to navigate without artificial illumination. The motion sensors start about 50 m from the secondary entrance. Diego whispers as they near the canyon, mounted on rocks and trees. Fairly basic technology. Thomas removes a small device from his pocket. This should create enough interference to buy us a window. Old trick, still works on most commercial systems. They pause at the edge of the sensor perimeter. Thomas activates the device, waits for the small green light to indicate successful interference, then nods. "We have 10 minutes before it cycles," and the sensors come back online. Moving swiftly but cautiously, the three advance toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, barely visible in the moonlight. Diego leads them into darkness that gradually gives way to dim artificial light. Inside, the natural cave has been modified crude concrete systems. They pause at the edge of the sensor perimeter. Thomas activates the device, waits for the small green light to indicate successful interference, then nods. "We have 10 minutes before it cycles," and the sensors come back online. Moving swiftly but cautiously, the three advance toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, barely visible in the moonlight. Diego leads them into darkness that gradually gives way to dim artificial light. Inside, the natural cave has been modified crude concrete flooring, electrical Wiring running along the walls, portable floodlights illumine a tunnel that slopes downward. Guards are stationed at the junction. Ahead, Diego whispers from here, "We need absolute silence, Margaret," and Thomas nod, falling into practice movements of people trained to operate in hostile territory. They advance slowly, pausing to place tiny surveillance cameras at key points along the route. The cave system opens into a larger chamber where the true scale of the operation becomes apparent. Stacked along one wall, a wooden crate stamped with shipping manifests from various countries. Another section contains metal cases, presumably weapons. Most disturbing are the animal transport cages, some empty, others containing exotic birds, reptiles, and small mammals, all destined for illegal wildlife trade. A guard sits at a small desk near the entrance to this chamber, his attention focused on a soccer match playing on a tablet. Thomas signals to Margaret and Diego to wait while he advances silently behind the guard. One swift practice motion renders the man unconscious. Without a sound, office is through there. Diego indicates a crude doorway at the rear of the chamber. The ledger should be in a filing cabinet behind the desk. "I'll cover the entrance." Thomas says, "You two get what we need. 5 minutes." Then we move Margaret and Diego slip into the office, a glorified storage room with a metal desk and filing cabinets. Diego goes straight to a cabinet in the corner, examining the lock. "Need a key or tool?" He whispers. Margaret produces her combat knife, inserting the tip into the lock mechanism with expert precision. After a few tense moments, the lock clicks open inside. They find exactly what they're looking for, a leather-bound ledger containing detailed records of shipments, payments, and front companies, page after page of damning evidence linking Verde development to the Aguila Cartel smuggling operation. This is it. Margaret breathes, photographing key pages with miniature camera names, dates, amounts, everything we need. A sudden noise from the main chamber alerts them. Thomas appears in the doorway, his expression urgent. Company. He whispers, 3 vehicles just pulled up outside. We need to move now. Margaret quickly returns a ledger to its place, ensuring it looks undisturbed. She slips the miniature camera into her pocket as Thomas motions urgently toward a narrow passage branching off in the main office. Back exit, he whispers to Diego. Diego nods. Maintenance tunnel leads to a ventilation shaft that exits about 100 m up the ridge. The sound of voices echoes from the main chamber, men speaking rapidly in Spanish. Boots on concrete. Margaret recognizes one voice giving orders, deeper, more authoritative than the others. Victor Ramirez has arrived personally. Diego tenses at the sound of his uncle's voice. He never comes here this late unless something's wrong. He knows. Margaret concludes the scouts miss their check-in. They move swiftly through the narrow maintenance passage. Thomas in the lead, Margaret bringing up the rear with Diego between them. The tunnel is cramped, barely wide enough for Thomas's broad shoulders, forcing him to move in a hunched position. The passage ends at a vertical shaft with metal rungs embedded in the rock wall. Thomas begins climbing, immediately testing each rung before put his full weight on it. Behind them, shouts echo through the tunnel. Their absence has been discovered. Move. Thomas urges from above. They'll have the main entrance covered in minutes. Diego climbs next, moving with the urgency of someone who knows exactly what capture would mean. Margaret follows, ignoring the protest of her aging knees. The shaft rises nearly 30 feet before opening to night air through a narrow gap between boulders. Thomas helps them both out onto the rocky slope above the cave system. They can see headlights on the dirt track below. 3 SUVs parked haphazardly, men with flashlights spreading out from the main entrance. They'll check the ventilation. Exit. Diego whispers, "Standard procedure." "How many men total?" Thomas asks. "With those vehicles, probably 12, including my uncle." Thomas surveys their position. Ridgeline offers cover to the north. If we can reach it before they organize a proper search. A shout from below interrupts them. Flashlight beams swing toward the ventilation exit as 3 men begin climbing toward their position. Too late. Margaret says, "We need to split up multiple targets." Confused, the search pattern. Tomas nods. Agreement. Rendezvous at the old pump station. "We pass on the way." And Diego, "You know." "Yes." Margaret. "West along the ridge." Diego, "Northeast down the wash." "I'll draw them south." Move. They separate. Without further discussion, Margaret scrambles along the rocky ridge line, keeping low, using boulders and scrub brush for cover behind her. A single gunshot echoes through the canyon. Thomas, creating a diversion. The ploy works. Flashlight beams and shouting converge in Thomas's direction, giving Margaret and Diego clean escape routes. Margaret moves steadily westward, her breathing controlled despite the exertion, falling back on decades-old training that her body remembers, even as her joints protest. After 20 minutes of careful navigation through the difficult terrain, Margaret reaches the abandoned pump station, a concrete structure half buried in the hillside remnant of a failed mining operation. She waits in the shadows, listening intently. For pursuit, Diego arrives 10 minutes later, breathing hard but unharmed. He takes cover beside Margaret in the darkness of the pump house. Any sign of Thomas? She asks quietly. Diego shakes his head, nothing. But I heard vehicles moving south. Margaret checks her watch. He'll make it. He's done this before. So have you? Diego observes you move like someone who spent time in the field long time ago. Margaret acknowledges different life. They wait in tense silence for another 30 minutes before a soft whistle from outside alerts them. Thomas appears in the doorway, a thin trail of blood visible on his sleeve, just a graze. He says, noting Margaret's concerned glance, they're enthusiastic, but not particularly accurate shooters. Did you lose him? Diego asks. For now, they've called in reinforcements, though radio chatter indicates at least 2 more vehicles heading this way from Nogales. Thomas turns to Margaret. Did you get what we needed? Margaret pats her pocket. With a camera, it's secured. Everything, names, dates, amounts, connections to Verde development, enough to force federal action. Then we move. Thomas decides they'll establish a perimeter, start a grid search at dawn. We need to reach the sanctuary. Call in your FBI contact while we still have darkness. For cover to track back to the Sancta takes twice as long as their approach, as they're forced to detour around areas where cartel vehicles patrol the back roads. Dawn is breaking by the time they slip through the sanctuary's perimeter fence. Sarah meets them at the main building, her relief at seeing them palpable. Thank God. Sheriff Dawson called 3 times those scouts. You captured their people who've been asking questions in town, flashing your photo around where the scouts now. Thomas asks Sheriff's custody. He moved them quietly to the county jail in Sierra Vista, listed under false charges. To keep it off the radar, smart. Margaret proves. What about the animals Dr. Patel evacuated? The last transportable ones an hour ago. Only the large predators remain, the ones too risky to move. Margaret nods. Please could get some rest. Sarah, we have what we need, but things are going to escalate before they improve. After Sarah leaves, Margaret downloads the photos from a miniature camera to her laptop. The evidence is damning. Detailed records of shipments coordinated through Verde Development Properties, payoffs to local official, schedules of border crossings, even inventory lists of exotic animals acquired and sold. This is huge. Diego says, examining the photos, my uncle documented everything, dates, amounts, names. He's implicated dozens of people. Control through knowledge. Thomas observes common tactic for cartel leaders. If everyone knows you have dirt on them, they think twice about betrayal. Margaret sends the files to Jane and Sheriff Dawson, then uses a satellite phone to call her FBI contact directly. Agent Rodriguez, a crisp female voice, answers. This is Margaret Wilson. Jane Jenkins gave me your contact information. We have documentation linking the Aguilar Cartel to Verde Development Group and a major smuggling operation using my property. As cover, I've just received your files. Agent Rodriguez confirms. This is significant, Miss Wilson, but I need to verify authenticity before I can request a full task force. How long? Optimistically 12 hours to authenticate, another 6 to 8 to assemble and deploy a team. We don't have that kind of time. Margaret says urgently. The cartel knows we've accessed their records. They're mobilizing now. I understand your concern, Agent Rodriguez says, but I can't bypass protocols without absolute certainty. If these records were planted or manipulated, they weren't. Diego interjects. I'm Diego Ramirez, Victor Ramirez's nephew. I can testify to the authenticity of those records. A long pause follows. Mr. Ramirez, your testimony will be extremely valuable, but it also complicates matters. We would need to establish protective custody, formal deposition, which all takes time. We don't have. Margaret interrupts Agent Rodriguez. The cartel is planning to destroy my sanctuary and eliminate witnesses within hours, not days. I'll expedite everything I can. Agent promises. In the meantime, I strongly advise you to evacuate the premises immediately. Let law enforcement handle this. After ending the call, Margaret turns to Thomas and Diego. We're on our own until the FBI gets there. Bureaucratic approval. Sheriff Dawson. Thomas suggests limited resources, and he can't move officially without federal backup, not against this level of cartel activity. Margaret studies the sanctuary map spread across her desk. We need to prepare for their arrival. You're not considering fighting them directly? Diego asks incredulously. My uncle will bring every available man, at least 20 heavily armed. Not fighting, Margaret clarifies, delaying, making it costly enough that they hesitate long enough for federal backup to arrive. Thomas examines the map with a professional eye. Defensive positions here, and here. Limited access points. Clear fields of fire. You've maintained this place with security in mind, whether you realize it or not. Force of habit. Margaret acknowledges. A vehicle approaches outside Sheriff Dawson's patrol SUV. The sheriff enters without knocking, his expression grim. Got your files. He says without preamble, already forwarded them to every federal contact I have. But Margaret, this is bigger than anything we've dealt with locally. How many deputies can you spare? She asks. Officially none. This is outside my jurisdiction without federal authorization. He removes his hat, rubbing his forehead. Unofficially, I'll be here. Might convince 2 of my most trusted deputies to take some personal time. As well, 3 against 20 isn't great odds, Thomas observes. 4, Diego corrects. I know their tactics, their communication protocols. 5, Margaret adds. This is my sanctuary, Sheriff Dorson surveys the unlikely defensive force, a 73-year-old former intelligence operative. Her 77-year-old ex-Delta Force brother, a young man betraying his cartel family, and a small-town sheriff nearing retirement. Well, he says with gallows humor, at least we have surprise on our side. They won't be expecting much resistance from a wildlife sanctuary, the sheriff's radio crackles. He steps outside to answer it, returning moments later, with renewed urgency. Cartel vehicles spotted on County Road 22 heading this way, at least 4 SUVs moving fast sooner than expected, Margaret says, checking her watch. They're not waiting for darkness. They know we have the evidence, Diego explains. They shifting to damage control, eliminate witnesses, destroy any proof before it can be verified. Thomas moves to the window, scanning the approach road with binoculars for vehicles' heavily tinted windows. Standard cartel configuration. Lead vehicle for command, others for muscle. ETA 10 minutes. At their current speed, Sheriff, get your men on stand by, but keep them back, Margaret instructs, if this goes sideways. We'll need official response. What are you planning? Sheriff Dorson asks. Suspiciously negotiation, Margaret says. Simply buy time for your federal contact to mobilize. As the sheriff departs, promising to remain close, Margaret turns to Diego. Will your uncle come himself? Absolutely. This is personal now, family betrayal threat to his operation. He'll want to handle it directly. Good. That G gives us leverage. The cartel vehicles arrive precisely as Thomas predicted, dust billowing behind them as they pull up. In a semicircle before the main gate, men emerge, hard-faced, weapons visible, but not yet drawn, spreading out in practice formation. From the lead vehicle, a heavy-set man in his 50s. Emerges Victor Ramirez, carries himself with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to opposition. His expensive shirt and boots pressed present the image of a successful businessman, but his eyes tell a different story, cold, calculating, capable of ordering deaths without hesitation. Margaret steps onto the porch of the main building alone by design. Thomas positions himself out of sight with a clear view of the proceedings, while Diego remains inside his presence. Their ace card, Ms. Wilson, Victor calls his English precise despite accent. I believe you have something that belongs to me, Mr. Ramirez. Margaret acknowledges calmly. I'm afraid you're mistaken. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Victor smiles. Without warmth, let's dispense with the games you entered. My facility last night you took photographs of. Private documents. I want the camera. And any copies you made those documents detail criminal enterprises. Margaret replies, they've already been sent to federal authorities.